Some arrangements arrive through ordinary channels, disguised in the formal language of legal proceedings, bearing the crisp letterhead of respectable law firms. Yet beneath their mundane exterior lies something far more profound, a thread that, when pulled, unravels generations of carefully maintained silence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by standard post to an apartment in Portland, Oregon. The recipient, Jordan Thorne, age 34, had never heard of Blackwood Associates, nor could they recall any connection to a great-aunt named Cordelia Blackwood. The correspondence was brief, formal, and utterly bewildering. Dear Mr. Thorne, we represent the estate of Cordelia Blackwood, recently deceased. According to her last will and testament, you have been named as sole beneficiary of the Blackwood family property, located at 1847 Millbrook Road, Gray Hollow, Vermont. The inheritance includes the house, grounds, and all contents therein, valued at approximately $1.2 million. However, the bequest comes with a specific condition that must be fulfilled within 60 days of this notification. You must remain on the property continuously, from sunrise to sunset, for 30 consecutive days. Departure from the grounds before sunset on any given day will result in forfeiture of the entire inheritance. Should you choose to accept these terms, please contact our office to arrange the transfer of keys and relevant documentation. Yours in service, Harold Whitmore, Escorpor. The peculiarity of the arrangement was immediately apparent. Jordan read the letter 3 times, searching for some indication of a mistake, perhaps a mix-up in family names or addresses. Yet the personal details were accurate: birth date, social security number, current address, all precisely correct. A phone call to Blackwood Associates revealed little additional information. Harold Whitmore spoke in the measured tones of a man who had delivered this same message before, his voice carrying the weight of practiced routine despite the bizarre nature of the terms. Yes, the inheritance was legitimate. No, the conditions could not be altered. The 30-day vigil was non-negotiable, as stipulated by Miss Blackwood herself. Has anyone else attempted this arrangement? Jordan asked, the question hanging in the phone line's static silence. Whitmore's pause stretched uncomfortably long. There have been previous candidates, he said finally. The property has been in the Blackwood family for over a century. Miss Cordelia was the last direct descendant. And the others? Did they complete the 30 days? I'm afraid I cannot discuss the specifics of other cases, Whitmore replied, his tone growing more formal. Privacy considerations, you understand. However, I will say that the property remains available for inheritance, should you choose to accept the terms. The implications were clear enough. Jordan spent the following days researching what little could be found about the Blackwood family and their Vermont property. Public records showed a large Victorian house built in 1887, its ownership passing through the family line with unusual gaps, periods where the property appeared to sit empty, reverting to distant relatives who had never actually taken possession. The more Jordan investigated, the more questions arose. Why would a relative they had never met leave them such a valuable inheritance? Why the bizarre condition about remaining until sunset? And most troubling of all, why did every search for Blackwood family Vermont return results that seemed deliberately vague, as if the family's history had been carefully scrubbed from public record? The 60-day deadline approached like a slow-moving storm. Jordan took a leave of absence from their marketing job, arranged for mail forwarding, and prepared for what they hoped would be either a profitable month in the countryside or, at worst, an interesting story to tell. What they could not have anticipated was how the arrangement would test not just their patience, but their understanding of what constitutes reality itself. The drive to Gray Hollow, Vermont, takes one through a landscape that seems suspended between seasons, where autumn lingers with deliberate persistence, even as winter presses at the boundaries. The town itself consists of little more than a post office, a general store, and a cluster of houses that have weathered decades with quiet resignation. Local residents offered polite but cautious acknowledgement when asked about the Blackwood property, a universally brief response that suggested both familiarity and reluctance to discuss the matter further. 7. Millbrook Road stands at the end of a gravel drive that winds through dense woodland for nearly half a mile. The trees press close on either side, their branches creating a canopy that filters sunlight into shifting patterns of light and shadow. The isolation is profound. No other houses are visible from the property. No sounds of traffic or neighbors penetrate the silence. The house itself rises from the landscape like something conjured from architectural memory. 3 stories of Victorian Gothic revival, complete with bay windows, wraparound porches, and decorative gingerbread trim that is weathered to the color of old bones. Paint peels in long strips from the siding, and several shutters hang at odd angles, giving the structure an expression of perpetual weariness. Jordan arrived on a Monday morning in October, the car's engine ticking as it cooled in the circular drive. The keys provided by Whitmore's office fit perfectly in the heavy oak door, which opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire structure. The sound carried the weight of prolonged disuse, of spaces that had grown accustomed to emptiness. The interior revealed rooms frozen in time, furniture draped in white sheets like mourning shrouds. The air held the particular stillness found only in houses that have been vacant for extended periods, not merely empty, but abandoned to their own devices. Dust motes danced in shafts of light that penetrated the heavy curtains, and the floorboards creaked underfoot with each step, as if the house were announcing the presence of its unexpected occupant. The first peculiarity became apparent within hours of arrival. Despite the October weather, certain rooms maintained temperatures that seemed to defy natural explanation. The parlor remained uncomfortably cold, even with the heating system functioning, while the upstairs bedrooms retained a warmth that felt almost stifling. Jordan moved from room to room with a growing sense of unease, unable to identify any logical reason for these temperature variations. More disturbing still was the behavior of shadows throughout the house. In the late afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows at acute angles, shadows fell in patterns that didn't align with the furniture or architectural features that should have cast them. A chair position near the eastern window created a shadow that stretched toward the west, defying the sun's position. Window frames cast shadows that extended into rooms where no light could possibly reach. The basement, accessed through a door beneath the main staircase, revealed storage areas filled with the accumulated possessions of multiple generations. Trunks containing clothing from different eras sat alongside furniture covered in heavy canvas. The air down here carried a different quality, thicker somehow, and touched with the faint scent of something Jordan couldn't identify. Not decay exactly, but something organic and old, like leaves that had been pressed between book pages for decades. On the 3rd day, Jordan discovered that every clock in the house had stopped at different times. The grandfather clock in the hallway showed 4:17. The mantel clock in the parlor had ceased at 6:42. Upstairs, bedroom clocks displayed 3:33, 7:29, and 2:15. None of these times corresponded to sunset, yet each seemed deliberately frozen at its particular moment, as if time itself had grown unreliable within the house's walls. Sleep, when it came, brought no relief from the house's peculiar atmosphere. Jordan had chosen the master bedroom for its size and the functionality of its furniture, but rest remained elusive. The walls seemed to retain sounds, footsteps from empty rooms, doors closing when no wind stirred, the faint whisper of conversation from somewhere deeper in the house. These noises never lasted long enough to investigate, yet they occurred with enough frequency to create a constant state of alertness. By the end of the first week, a routine had developed. Rise with the sun, which penetrated the house's interior with reluctance. Spend the daylight hours exploring rooms, cataloging the possessions of previous inhabitants, trying to understand the history of the place and the family that had called it home. Watch the light fade through the windows as afternoon progressed toward evening, always conscious of the approaching sunset and the mysterious importance of remaining on the property until darkness fell. It was during one of these evening vigils that Jordan first noticed the true strangeness of the arrangement. How the house seemed to pulse with a different energy as sunset approached, how the temperature variations became more pronounced, how the sounds from empty rooms grew more frequent and distinct. Whatever was happening at 1847 Millbrook Road, it followed patterns that had been established long before Jordan's arrival, patterns that suggested the 30-day arrangement was not merely an eccentric legal requirement, but something far more essential to the property's very existence. Discovery often comes through methodical persistence rather than dramatic revelation. On the 8th day of the arrangement, while exploring the 2nd floor, Jordan found a door that had initially appeared to be another bedroom. The brass nameplate, nearly black with tarnish, read, "Private Study." Inside lay what could only be described as a family archive. Generations of documents, photographs, and personal effects arranged with the precision of someone who understood their historical importance. The room itself defied the decay evident elsewhere in the house. While dust covered the surfaces, the space felt deliberately maintained, as if someone had been caring for it long after the family's other concerns had been abandoned. Built-in shelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers, photograph albums, and boxes of correspondence organized by decade. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers held down by glass paperweights that caught and fractured the afternoon light. The earliest documents dated to 1887, written in the careful script of the house's original owner, Ezra Blackwood. His journal entries revealed a man consumed with financial anxiety, his textile business failing as larger companies dominated the market. The entries from late 1887 spoke of mounting debts, the possibility of losing the family home, and his desperate search for solutions that conventional business practices could not provide. November 15, 1887. The banker's visit confirmed my worst fears. Without immediate payment, we shall lose everything by spring. Margaret grows more distant with each passing day, and I fear what this failure will mean for our children's futures. Yet Silas Moorcock spoke of arrangements that transcend ordinary business dealings. He claims knowledge of methods that ensure prosperity, though the details of such arrangements remain deliberately vague. Perhaps desperate times require desperate measures. Subsequent entries grew increasingly cryptic, referencing meetings in the woods surrounding the property, conversations with individuals whose names were never recorded, and preparations for what Ezra referred to only as the arrangement. His handwriting began to deteriorate as winter progressed, the careful script becoming hurried and erratic. December 21, 1887. The winter solstice approaches, and with it, the opportunity Moorcock described. I have walked the boundaries of our land at sunset for 7 consecutive days now, marking the places where the cold seems to penetrate most deeply. There are spots among the trees where shadows linger even in bright daylight, where the very air feels different, thicker somehow, and touched with a presence that watches and waits. If the arrangement succeeds, our financial troubles will end. If it fails, I dare not consider such possibilities. The final entry in Ezra's journal, dated December 22nd, in 1887, consisted of only a single line: "It is done. May God forgive what prosperity has required." The archive contained extensive documentation of the Blackwood family's subsequent history, and the pattern that emerged painted a disturbing picture of the arrangement's long-term consequences. Each generation produced at least one family member who served as what the documents referred to as the guardian, someone who maintained the family's obligation to remain on the property from sunrise to sunset, year after year, decade after decade. Photographs from different eras showed these guardians, always posed in the same location on the front porch, always with the same expression of weary resignation. The images spanned nearly a century. Ezra's son William in 1923, stern-faced and prematurely gray. William's daughter Elizabeth in 1954, her eyes holding a knowledge that seemed far older than her apparent age. Elizabeth's nephew Marcus in 1978, his smile failing to mask an underlying exhaustion that seemed to emanate from within. The most recent photograph showed Cordelia Blackwood herself, dated 2019. Unlike her predecessors, Cordelia's expression held something different. Not resignation, but determination. Her journal entries, found in a separate ledger, revealed a woman who had spent decades researching the family's arrangement, seeking ways to break what she had come to understand as a generational curse. March 3, 2019. 47 years. I have maintained the vigil, 47 years of sunrise to sunset confinement to these grounds. I have sacrificed marriage, children, any hope of a normal life, all to honor an arrangement I never chose. But my research has finally yielded results. The obligation can be transferred but only to blood family, and only through specific legal mechanisms that ensure the new guardian understands and accepts the terms. The entity that Ezra bound to our family feeds on fear and desperation, but it also requires the willing presence of a family member to maintain the boundary that prevents its influence from spreading beyond our property. Should the vigil ever be abandoned completely, the consequences would extend far beyond our family line. Cordelia's later entries detailed her efforts to locate distant relatives, her careful research into bloodlines and family connections that had scattered across the country over the decades. Jordan's name appeared in multiple entries, along with detailed information about their life, their financial situation, their apparent lack of close family ties that might complicate the transfer of obligation. August 17, 2023. Jordan Thorne represents our best hope for continuing the arrangement. Their life circumstances make them ideal. No spouse, no children, no obligations that cannot be temporarily set aside. The inheritance will provide adequate motivation, and the 30-day trial period will allow them to understand the true nature of what they are accepting. I pray they prove stronger than I have been, that they can find a way to end what I have only managed to perpetuate. The archive's final section contained correspondence with occult researchers, historians specializing in New England folklore, and individuals who claimed expertise in supernatural phenomena. Their responses painted a consistent picture. The Blackwood arrangement was neither unique nor impossible to break, but doing so required specific knowledge and considerable risk. Several letters warned against attempting to abandon the vigil without proper preparation, citing examples of similar arrangements that had ended in tragedy when the supernatural obligations were simply ignored rather than properly severed. As afternoon faded toward evening on that 8th day, Jordan sat surrounded by generations of family history, understanding for the first time the true weight of the inheritance they had accepted. The 30-day arrangement wasn't a trial period. It was an initiation, a gradual introduction to an obligation that had consumed the lives of their predecessors for over a century. Outside the study windows, shadows began to lengthen across the grounds, and somewhere deeper in the house, a door closed with the soft finality of a decision made long ago. Understanding brings its own burden. With the knowledge gleaned from the family archive, Jordan's perception of the daily routine shifted from curious exploration to conscious participation in something far older and more complex than a simple inheritance arrangement. The house, which had initially seemed merely eccentric, now revealed itself as a carefully maintained prison, designed to contain something that should never be allowed to roam freely. The journal that Jordan began keeping on the 10th day documented not just the passage of time, but the gradual revelation of the property's true nature. Each entry captured the subtle changes that occurred as autumn deepened and the arrangement progressed toward its conclusion. Day 10. The cold spots in the parlor have expanded. What began as a small area near the fireplace now encompasses nearly half the room. The temperature difference is significant enough to see my breath when I stand in certain locations. Retroubling. The cold seems to move, shifting position throughout the day as if guided by some intelligence that understands my presence and adjusts accordingly. Day 12. Footsteps in the rooms above have become a regular occurrence, usually around midday when the sunlight is strongest. The sounds are distinctly human, the weight and rhythm of someone walking deliberately from room to room. Yet investigation always reveals empty spaces, furniture undisturbed, dust patterns showing no evidence of recent movement. The footsteps have begun to feel less like intrusion and more like patrol, something checking the boundaries, ensuring all remains as it should. Day 15. Found additional documentation hidden behind a loose board in the study. Previous guardians left warnings, carved into the wood itself. Never leave before dark. It grows stronger when alone. The boundary holds only with blood witness. The handwriting varies, suggesting multiple generations of family members felt compelled to leave these messages for their successors. The psychological strain of constant vigilance began to manifest in unexpected ways. Jordan found themselves checking and rechecking the time, calculating sunset to the minute, never venturing beyond the property line even for brief errands. The nearest neighbor lived over a mile away, and the isolation created a sense of temporal displacement. Days began to blur together, distinguished only by the subtle changes in the house's supernatural manifestations. Sleep became increasingly elusive as the arrangement progressed. The sounds from empty rooms grew more frequent and distinct, no longer confined to footsteps but expanding to include voices, whispered conversations in a language that seemed almost familiar but remained just beyond comprehension. These voices carried an emotional weight that penetrated dreams, filling sleep with images of figures moving through the house's corridors, their faces obscured by shadows that moved independently of any light source. Day 18. The entity's presence has become unmistakable. It doesn't manifest visually, but its influence permeates every aspect of the house. Doors that were closed in the morning stand open by afternoon. Objects move when I'm not looking, books shifted on shelves, chairs turned to face different directions, photographs rearranged in ways that feel deliberately meaningful. It's testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses in my resolve. Day 20. Discovered scratches on the inside of the front door, deep gouges in the wood that weren't there before. They form patterns that might be letters in an alphabet I don't recognize, or perhaps territorial markings left by something that understands the importance of thresholds. The scratches appear only on the interior side of the door, as if something inside has been trying to get out. The most disturbing development occurred on the 22nd day, when Jordan first felt the overwhelming compulsion to leave before sunset. The urge came suddenly, around 4 in the afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen across the grounds. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper. A bone-deep certainty that remaining on the property after dark would result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. The compulsion grew stronger as sunset approached, manifesting as physical discomfort, difficulty breathing, and an almost irresistible need to walk to the car and drive away immediately. Jordan paced the interior of the house, gripping door frames and furniture to maintain physical connection to the property while their mind screamed warnings about the approaching darkness. Day 22. The entity doesn't want me here after sunset. The realization is both terrifying and revealing. Whatever Ezra Blackwood bound to this property is compelled to remain as long as a family member maintains the vigil, but it resents the arrangement and fights against it daily. The closer we get to sunset, the stronger its influence becomes, and the more desperately it tries to convince me to abandon my post. Understanding this helps, but doesn't make the compulsion easier to resist. Physical manifestations accompanied the psychological pressure. Temperature fluctuations became extreme, with rooms shifting from stifling heat to bitter cold within minutes. Shadows moved across walls without corresponding movement of objects that should have cast them. The whispered voices grew louder and more distinct, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind Jordan's shoulder, speaking words that felt important but remained frustratingly incomprehensible. The house's electrical systems began to fail intermittently. Lights flickered without pattern, sometimes dimming to near darkness before blazing back to full brightness. The heating system cycled on and off seemingly at random, creating sudden changes in air pressure that made doors slam throughout the structure. Even the telephone, which had worked reliably since Jordan's arrival, began producing strange sounds during attempted calls, voices speaking in reverse, music from decades past, and occasionally the sound of someone breathing steadily into the receiver. Day 25. 5 days remaining. The entity's desperation has become palpable. It knows the arrangement is nearly complete, and its attempts to drive me away have intensified accordingly. Last night I found every door in the house standing open, despite having closed and locked them before bed. This morning, the family photographs had been turned face down, as if something couldn't bear to look at the faces of those who had maintained the vigil before me. Jordan's journal entries from the final week revealed a growing understanding of the supernatural mechanics governing the property. The entity bound by Ezra's arrangement possessed intelligence and agency, but remained constrained by rules that limited its ability to cause direct harm to family members who maintained the vigil. It could influence, frighten, and manipulate, but it could not force a guardian to abandon their post through violence. This knowledge provided some comfort, but also raised disturbing questions about what would happen once the 30-day arrangement concluded. Would the obligation end there, as the inheritance document suggested, or was Jordan being gradually prepared for a longer commitment, perhaps the lifetime of guardianship that had consumed their predecessors? The answer, Jordan suspected, would become clear as the final sunset approached. Truth reveals itself through fragments, scattered across generations like pieces of a puzzle that no single person was meant to complete. On the 26th day of the arrangement, Jordan discovered the final piece of documentation that explained not just the Blackwood family's obligation, but the precise nature of what Ezra had awakened in the woods surrounding their property. Hidden within the false bottom of an old cedar chest, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved it for over a century, lay Ezra's original agreement. Not the journal entries Jordan had found previously, but the actual contract that had sealed his family's fate, written in two distinctly different hands on parchment that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. The first portion, in Ezra's careful script, detailed his desperate financial situation and his willingness to enter into any arrangement that might preserve his family's security. The second portion, written in flowing characters that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly, outlined the terms of what it called the Covenant of Sustenance. The entity that had answered Ezra's call for help was far older than the New England settlements, something that had dwelt in the deep woods since before human memory. The document referred to it only as the Hungry Darkness, a presence that fed on human fear, despair, and the particular energy generated by souls trapped in impossible circumstances. Ezra's bargain had been horrifically simple. In exchange for unlimited financial prosperity, his family line would provide the entity with a steady source of the emotional nourishment it required. One family member from each generation would serve as guardian, maintaining constant vigil from sunrise to sunset, their presence creating a supernatural barrier that contained the entity within the property boundaries while simultaneously providing it with the fear and isolation it needed to survive. The sunset requirement was not arbitrary. As the document explained in its flowing, unsettling script, the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grew weakest during the transition from day to night. During these twilight hours, the entity possessed enough strength to extend its influence beyond the property, unless a willing family member remained present to reinforce the containment through their fear, their desperation, and their growing understanding of the trap they could never escape. Should the vigil be abandoned, the contract specified, the Hungry Darkness shall be free to expand its influence beyond the established boundaries, seeking sustenance from whatever sources, present themselves until such time as a new agreement is reached or the original covenant is restored through blood sacrifice. Previous guardians had understood this reality. Their journals, scattered throughout the house and discovered during Jordan's methodical exploration, painted a consistent picture of family members who had initially intended to serve brief terms before finding other relatives to continue the arrangement. Instead, they had found themselves psychologically unable to abandon their posts, bound not just by supernatural compulsion, but by the terrible knowledge of what their departure would unleash upon innocent people in the surrounding area. William Blackwood had maintained the vigil for 38 years, dying at his post in 1961. His final journal entry, written with a hand trembling from age and exhaustion, read simply, "I have given my life to keep it contained. May whoever comes after me prove stronger than I have been." Elizabeth Blackwood had lasted 42 years, from 1961 to 2003. Her journals revealed multiple attempts to break the covenant through consultation with occult experts, religious authorities, and academic researchers. All had reached the same conclusion. The entity was too old and too powerful to be banished through conventional means. It could only be contained, transferred, or fed until it chose to seek sustenance elsewhere. A decision it had shown no inclination to make in over a century of feeding on Blackwood family despair. Marcus Blackwood had served only 16 years from 2003 to 2019 before suffering what official records called a complete nervous breakdown. His final journal entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described his growing certainty that the entity was not merely contained by the arrangement but was actively growing stronger, learning from each successive guardian, preparing for some larger purpose that none of them had yet understood. Cordelia's journals picked up where Marcus left off, revealing a woman who had inherited not just a supernatural obligation, but a research project spanning decades. Her work had uncovered references to similar entities throughout New England folklore, suggesting that the Blackwood arrangement was part of a larger pattern, ancient presences that had learned to exploit human desperation, binding families to serve as unwilling caretakers for creatures that existed primarily to consume human suffering. "The entity has been planning something," Cordelia had written in one of her final entries. "Each guardian provides it with more than sustenance. We provide it with knowledge. Knowledge of human psychology, of family bonds, of the precise mechanisms that create and maintain despair. It has been studying us for over a century, and I fear it is preparing to expand its influence in ways the original covenant never anticipated. This revelation cast Jordan's 30-day arrangement in an entirely different light. Rather than a simple inheritance trial, the period served as an evaluation, the entity determining whether its new potential guardian possessed the psychological makeup necessary for long-term service, whether they could be gradually conditioned to accept a lifetime of imprisonment disguised as family obligation. On the 27th day, as Jordan sat in the study surrounded by generations of family documentation, the true horror of their situation became clear. The inheritance was not conditional upon completing 30 days. It was conditional upon accepting a lifetime commitment that none of their predecessors had been strong enough to break. The entity had been watching, learning, preparing Jordan for the moment when they would be offered the same choice that had faced every Blackwood guardian: abandon the vigil and accept responsibility for whatever consequences followed, or remain at the property and gradually surrender their life to maintaining a supernatural prison that grew stronger with each passing year. Outside the study windows, sunset approached with its usual deliberate pace, and in the shadows between the trees, something ancient and patient continued its century-long wait for the next phase of an arrangement that had never been intended to end. Some truths arrived not as revelation but as inevitability, the logical conclusion to patterns that have been building across decades. On the morning of the 28th day, Jordan awoke to find that the house had changed during the night in ways that suggested the entity's patience was finally wearing thin. Every door in the structure stood wide open, not just unlocked, but held in position as if by invisible hands. The sensation upon entering each room was of interrupting a conversation that had ceased moments before arrival, of walking through spaces where presence lingered like smoke after a fire has been extinguished. The house felt occupied by something vast and attentive, something that had decided concealment was no longer necessary. The kitchen, which had remained functional throughout Jordan's stay, now showed signs of supernatural interference that bordered on the theatrical. Cabinet doors hung open to reveal contents rearranged in patterns that might have been meaningful. Canned goods sorted by color rather than type. Dishes stacked in precise pyramids, silverware arranged in geometric designs that created shadows resembling occult symbols when morning light struck them at certain angles. More disturbing were the personal belongings that had appeared overnight. Jordan's own possessions, clothes, books, electronic devices, had been moved from the master bedroom and distributed throughout the house in a manner that felt deliberately invasive. A laptop sat open on the dining room table, its screen displaying a document that Jordan had never created. A formal letter of resignation from their job in Portland dated for submission at the conclusion of the 30-day period. The letter was written in Jordan's own voice, explaining their decision to accept a permanent position managing their inherited property, to embrace the solitude and responsibility that came with maintaining the family estate. The document felt like a glimpse into a future that had been decided without consultation, a life path that the entity had been planning throughout the entire arrangement. Day 28. It knows the arrangement is nearly complete, and its true nature is finally becoming clear. This was never about 30 days of residence. It was about 30 days of psychological conditioning, gradual preparation for accepting a permanent role as guardian. The entity has been studying my responses to fear, isolation, and supernatural phenomena, determining whether I possess the mental resilience necessary for long-term imprisonment. The compulsion to leave before sunset, which had grown stronger each day, reached overwhelming intensity on the 28th day. By mid-afternoon, Jordan found it physically difficult to remain indoors, pacing from room to room in an attempt to manage the anxiety that seemed to emanate from the house's very foundations. The entity's presence felt more tangible than ever, not malevolent exactly, but utterly indifferent to human comfort or desire. Around 4 o'clock, Jordan discovered additional documentation that previous guardians had hidden throughout the house. Not in the organized archive of the study, but scattered in places that suggested desperate, secret communication with future family members. Behind loose floorboards, taped inside cabinet drawers, written on the undersides of furniture, these messages painted a picture of growing desperation across multiple generations. The entity grows stronger with each guardian. Read a note found behind the kitchen staircase, written in faded ink that might have been Elizabeth's hand. It learns from our fears, adapts to our weaknesses. What it could not accomplish through Ezra, it achieved through William. What William could not provide, it extracted from me. We are not guardians, we are food, carefully cultivated and maintained for optimal harvest. Marcus had left longer messages, hidden with greater care and written in the precise handwriting of someone fighting to maintain sanity under impossible circumstances. The 30-day arrangement is designed to identify individuals psychologically capable of long-term isolation. Those who complete the trial period demonstrate the specific combination of resilience and vulnerability that the entity requires for sustained feeding. We do not inherit the property, we inherit the prison, with ourselves as both jailer and prisoner. Cordelia's hidden messages were the most recent and most detailed, revealing the full scope of her research into the supernatural mechanics governing the property. She had discovered that the entity's influence extended far beyond simple containment. It had been actively manipulating events to ensure the continuation of the arrangement, influencing the lives of distant family members to create the circumstances that would drive them to accept the inheritance when their time came. Jordan's financial difficulties were not coincidental, one message revealed. The entity has limited ability to influence events beyond the property boundaries, but sufficient power to create the desperation necessary to make the inheritance seem like salvation rather than trap. It chose Jordan specifically for their psychological profile, isolated enough to accept 30 days of solitude, responsible enough to honor contractual obligations, empathetic enough to sacrifice personal freedom rather than risk harm to innocent people. The most disturbing revelation came in Cordelia's final hidden message, discovered behind a loose stone in the basement wall. The entity is preparing for expansion. Each guardian has provided it with knowledge about human society, modern communication, the psychological mechanisms that govern contemporary life. It no longer requires the Blackwood property as its sole base of operations. It has learned enough about human nature to establish similar arrangements elsewhere. The 30-day trial is not just guardian selection. It is final preparation for the entity to begin replicating the covenant with other families, creating a network of feeding sources that will span the continent. This knowledge transformed the weight of the decision facing Jordan. Refusing to continue the arrangement would not simply free them from supernatural obligation, it would release something that had spent over a century learning how to exploit human weakness on a scale far larger than a single family property. As the 28th sunset approached, Jordan stood at the boundary between the house and the surrounding woods, feeling the entity's presence pressing against their consciousness like a physical weight. The choice was no longer between freedom and captivity, but between personal sacrifice and collective responsibility, a decision that generations of family members had faced and found impossible to resolve. The entity waited with the patience of something that had outlived empires, confident in its understanding of human psychology, certain that Jordan would make the same choice that had trapped every previous guardian. After all, it had been studying them for nearly a month, learning their responses to isolation, fear, and moral obligation. What it had not anticipated was Jordan's discovery of Cordelia's research, or their growing understanding that the arrangement was not a family curse to be endured, but a supernatural predator to be confronted. The final 2 days would determine not just Jordan's fate, but the future of an entity that had grown complacent in its century of feeding on Blackwood family despair. Dawn on the 29th day brought with it a clarity that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. Jordan awoke not to the familiar weight of dread that had accompanied each previous morning, but to a sense of purpose that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than conscious decision. The entity's presence in the house felt different, not diminished but somehow expectant, as if it too understood that the arrangement was approaching its true conclusion. The documentation scattered throughout the house told a story of family members who had faced the same choice that now confronted Jordan: accept a lifetime of guardianship, or risk unleashing something that had grown far more dangerous than Ezra Blackwood could have imagined in 1887. Yet none of the previous guardians had possessed the complete picture that Jordan now held. Cordelia's research, combined with the hidden messages left by her predecessors, revealed not just the entity's nature, but its vulnerabilities. The covenant that bound the hungry darkness to the property was not unbreakable. It was, however, sustained by the willing presence of family members who understood its terms and accepted them out of fear for the consequences of abandonment. The entity's power derived not from supernatural authority, but from psychological manipulation. Its ability to convince each generation of guardians that they had no choice but to maintain the arrangement. Cordelia's research had uncovered references to similar entities that had been successfully banished through what occult scholars termed informed refusal, the deliberate rejection of supernatural obligations by individuals who fully understood both the entity's nature and the actual scope of their power. The key was not courage in the face of the unknown, but knowledge that stripped away the illusion of inevitability that such creatures use to maintain their hold over human victims. The entity feeds on despair, Cordelia had written in one of her final research notes, but despair requires hopelessness. An individual who understands that the supernatural obligation is a choice rather than fate possesses the power to break the covenant entirely, not through ritual or ceremony, but through simple, informed refusal to participate further. The 29th day passed in a state of suspended tension, with Jordan moving through the house's familiar rooms while the entity's presence grew increasingly agitated. Doors slammed without wind, temperatures fluctuated wildly, and the whispered voices from empty rooms became a constant murmur of frustration and disbelief. The creature that had manipulated human psychology for over a century was encountering something it had not anticipated, a guardian who understood the game being played. As afternoon faded toward evening, Jordan made their preparations with the methodical precision of someone who had finally seen through a decades-long deception. The entity's true nature was not that of an ancient, all-powerful force, but of a parasite that had learned to mimic supernatural authority while remaining entirely dependent on human cooperation for its survival. The hungry darkness had grown strong by feeding on the despair of individuals who believed they had no choice but to serve as its guardians. It had maintained the Blackwood arrangement not through overwhelming power, but through psychological manipulation that convinced each successive family member that abandoning the vigil would result in catastrophic consequences. The reality, as Cordelia's research suggested, was far different. Entities like the hungry darkness were bound by rules that limited their influence to willing participants. They could frighten, manipulate, and create compelling illusions of threat, but they could not force unwilling individuals to serve as guardians indefinitely. The supernatural prison that had contained generations of Blackwood family members was maintained not by the entity's power, but by their own acceptance of its authority. As sunset approached on the 29th day, Jordan stood in the front yard of the property, feeling the entity's desperate attempts to reassert psychological control. The compulsion to remain until dark was stronger than ever, accompanied by vivid mental images of the consequences that would follow abandonment. Innocent people terrorized, communities destroyed, supernatural chaos unleashed across New England. Yet armed with knowledge of the entity's true nature, Jordan recognized these images for what they were: elaborate psychological theater designed to maintain a profitable arrangement that the creature was desperate not to lose. The hungry darkness had spent over a century feeding on Blackwood family despair, learning human psychology, growing stronger through psychological manipulation rather than supernatural evolution. The sun touched the horizon at 6:47 p.m. on that final evening of October, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed unusually vivid. Jordan walked to their car, started the engine, and drove slowly down the gravel drive that led away from the property. In the rearview mirror, the house remained unchanged. No supernatural manifestations, no cosmic consequences, no unleashing of ancient evil upon the world. The entity's century-long deception had finally encountered someone who understood that the most powerful supernatural prisons are those built from human psychology rather than otherworldly force. 6 months after leaving the Blackwood property, Jordan received another letter from Harold Whitmore's office. This correspondence, however, differed significantly from the original inheritance notification. Written in Whitmore's own hand rather than formal legal prose, it conveyed both frustration and a reluctant sort of respect. Mr. Thorne, I trust this letter finds you well in your return to Portland. I write to inform you that the Blackwood property remains vacant, as it has now for nearly 7 months. This represents the longest period of abandonment in the estate's recorded history. You may be interested to know that we have received no reports of supernatural activity in the Grey Hollow area. No unusual occurrences that might suggest the entity's influence has expanded beyond the property boundaries. This contradicts predictions that have governed our family's legal practice for over a century. However, I feel obligated to inform you that we continue to receive inquiries about the inheritance. Distant relatives, identified through genealogical research that extends far beyond our previous efforts, have expressed interest in accepting the arrangement. The entity, it seems, has not abandoned its efforts to secure a new guardian. The terms remain the same. They choose 30 days from sunrise to sunset, with full inheritance of property and assets for successful completion. We have extended offers to 3 additional family members in the past 6 months. Each has declined after receiving more detailed information about the property's history. I suspect you will not be surprised to learn that these individuals were provided with certain documents and research materials that previous candidates had not received. Information has a way of circulating, particularly when it concerns matters of family safety. Should you ever wish to discuss your experiences at the property, I would welcome the conversation. There are aspects of this arrangement that even our family's legal practice does not fully understand. Respectfully yours, Harold Whitmore. Jordan filed the letter away with other documents related to the inheritance, but did not respond. The decision to leave the property had been made with full knowledge of the consequences, and 6 months of normal life had confirmed the correctness of that choice. The entity had been revealed as a psychological predator rather than a supernatural force, powerful only when its victims believed in its authority. Yet the story of the Blackwood arrangement was far from over. Within the month, Jordan began receiving contact from other individuals who had been approached about similar inheritances. Properties in Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts that carried unusual stipulations and family obligations stretching back generations. The pattern was unmistakable. The entity, or others like it, had been establishing multiple feeding sources throughout New England, each sustained by families who believed they had no choice but to maintain supernatural arrangements that existed primarily in their own minds. The network that Cordelia had feared was already in place, but it was more fragile than anyone had realized. Built on psychological manipulation rather than genuine supernatural power, these arrangements could be dismantled through education rather than exorcism, through sharing information rather than performing rituals. Jordan began corresponding with these other potential inheritors, sharing the documentation found at the Blackwood property, explaining the research that revealed the true nature of such entities. Some listened and declined their inheritances outright. Others accepted but left before completing the trial periods, armed with the knowledge that the consequences of abandonment were psychological theater rather than supernatural reality. Yet not everyone chose freedom. Several individuals, despite being presented with evidence of the entity's true nature, elected to complete their arrangements and accept the role of guardian. For some, the isolation and supernatural drama provided a sense of purpose that conventional life had failed to offer. For others, the weight of family history and generational guilt made abandonment feel like betrayal, regardless of the logical arguments for freedom. The inheritance documents continue to circulate among distant family members, each new generation faced with the same choice that confronted their predecessors. Legal firms throughout New England maintain offices dedicated to managing these supernatural estates, their practices sustained by entities that have learned to adapt their feeding strategies to changing times and evolving understanding of their nature. The Blackwood property itself remains vacant, though not abandoned. Harold Whitmore's office continues to maintain the grounds and structure, preserving it against the possibility that a future family member might prove more susceptible to the arrangement than Jordan had been. The entity that once demanded constant guardianship has apparently settled into dormancy, waiting with the patience of something that has outlived centuries and expects to outlive centuries more. Local residents of Grey Hollow report no unusual phenomena associated with the empty house, no signs that abandoning the supernatural vigil has resulted in the consequences that previous guardians feared. The building stands as testament to the power of psychological manipulation, a prison that was never locked from the outside, maintained only by the belief that escape was impossible. The true horror of the Blackwood arrangement was not that it trapped innocent people in supernatural obligations, but that it convinced them the trap was real, when freedom had always been a matter of simply walking away. The entity's greatest power was not its ability to cause harm, but its ability to make people believe that harm was inevitable if they refused to serve its purposes. In the end, the most effective supernatural prisons are those built not from otherworldly force, but from human psychology, sustained not by ancient magic, but by the simple belief that some obligations transcend personal choice. The Blackwood family spent over a century maintaining an arrangement that existed primarily in their own minds, powerful only because each generation accepted that it had no choice but to honor the decisions made by their predecessors. The inheritance documents continued to arrive in mailboxes across the country, each bearing the promise of wealth in exchange for 30 days of residence at remote properties. Some recipients decline immediately, sensing something amiss in the unusual terms. Others investigate further, discovering the true nature of what they are being offered. And some, despite all evidence and explanation, choose to accept the arrangement anyway, not because they must, but because the alternative requires them to take responsibility for their own freedom. For these individuals, supernatural guardianship provides something that normal life cannot: the comfort of believing that their circumstances are beyond their control, that their isolation and sacrifice serve some greater purpose than personal choice. The entities that established these arrangements understood human psychology well enough to know that some people prefer elegant captivity to the uncertainty of freedom. They built their feeding systems not on supernatural compulsion, but on the basic human tendency to accept familiar prison rather than unknown liberation. The Blackwood property waits still, maintained by legal arrangements that span generations, preserved against the possibility that future family members will prove more willing to accept the comfort of supernatural obligation than the responsibility of informed choice. The entity that once fed on family despair has learned patience, understanding that psychological manipulation requires time to establish the conditions that make freedom seem less attractive than captivity. Somewhere in New England, other properties maintain similar vigils, sustained by individuals who have chosen supernatural guardianship over ordinary life. Their arrangements continue not because they must, but because the entities that established them understood that the most effective prisons are those that people build for themselves, convinced that the walls are there for someone else's protection. The sun sets each evening over empty houses that were never really haunted by anything more dangerous than human belief in their own powerlessness. And somewhere in the growing darkness, ancient things that learn to feed on psychological despair continue their patient wait for the next person who will choose the familiar comfort of supernatural obligation over the uncertain freedom of walking away.